Good morning. This is Debra V. Wilson. I am in Canada. It's the 23rd of May, 2018, Wednesday. Time is 300 hours and 25 minutes, and that's GMT minus 6. Yesterday, I watched a YouTube video from talkRadio. It was from Julia Hartley-Brewer show. She had as her guest in this particular segment. The video is just over 6 minutes. And the particular segment was the way in which, first of all, my apologies. The guest she had was Brendan O'Neill, who's the editor of Spiked Online. It'll be a lot of hemming and hawing through this because it's actually something I'm thinking through myself. So the whole ethos and heart and soul of my research is how civilians, civil society, experience national security modeling, the way in which a nation constructs keeping its citizens safe. I look at civil society, which is composed of civilians, because those are groupings of people, and civil society can represent an organized response that I think is easier and more effective to research. In my quest to understand how civilians experience national security modeling and feed that information back to the state via their activism. So after saying that, the crux of this interview is a very interesting one. The premise that the host Julia Hartley-Brewer is discussing with Mr. O'Neill is the way in which they both experience and understand the state seeking citizens to respond to terrorist attacks. And the terrorist attack in particular they're focused on is the 1-year anniversary of the Ariana Grande concert bombing from the 22nd of May 2017. The host of the show, Julia, and the guest, Brendan, both believe that the state encourages the response from civil society citizens to be one of continue to show resilience that will get through this without fraying of societal bonds. That, to quote, they want to show harmony between Muslims and the larger British society. We're all getting along. This bombing from a person who is identified and identifies as Muslim will not fray us. We will continue on. We are united as a country. The host and the speaker, the guest speaker, take the attitude that is opposed to that response. They believe, which they believe is a more emotional response, they believe an equally appropriate response from citizens is the space without criticism to question why the systemic causes for the continued extremism in the United Kingdom. One of the reasons they believe that Mr. O'Neill brings up and the host seconds it is they believe that the state encourages civilians to look at this through a more emotional lens is because to avoid increasing Islamophobia, or what I would say is the further demonization of the vast majority of Muslims who are not extremists, and ultimately that also frays the society. And I think that's I think that's the point here, and this is a messy podcast. I recognize that. I too have sought a more systemic intellectual understanding of how and why extremism happens, and the way in which the state responds, and the state's understanding, including operationally, of how to address extremism. So there's that on the one hand. On the other hand, as a Muslim, and as a Muslim who has been an activist in the UK, I get what I also believe the state is trying to do, and the certain response they want from civil society around these crimes, acts of extremism, is to not facilitate a space of further segregating certain parts of law-abiding society. I think the conversation around how and why extremism manifests itself in the UK is not going to be an easy one. I don't know the answer of who and how that is shepherded, so it is constructive. Because I do think when a terrorist attack happens, this one in particular, it targeted children, young people, and I think that is particularly outrageous for people. And I think that the state might find it, my opinion, easier if to encourage a response of let's do social cohesion and not tap into that justifiable rage, because that justifiable rage could possibly cause further erosions within the society. And my opinion is I do think the state is concerned about that. One of the things that I disagree with both the host and the guest is that I do think people are angry. I do think there is a rage and just regular, quote, everyday society, all parts and sectors of extremism, okay? I already think that rage is there. I think that what is happening, one of the things I suspect that is happening in the UK is the far right. The far right becomes almost a proxy for the rage that some in society feel about what is being perceived by some as the continual attack from Islamic extremists. That's my opinion. And I think that with some people in the far right, they become proxies for, quote unquote, my rage. So it's almost a venting for people who are not bigoted, who have no intent in being violent toward their neighbors. But it is a space and a way to give voice to the state without, quote unquote, me actually doing it. I think that is why Britain has become so attractive for the far right, because I think some people in the far right recognize and are glad to assume that role for a myriad of reasons. I'll say what you can't say, because I don't think there's an appetite for far right extremism in the UK, but I do think there is an anger, and I do think that that anger has produced an appetite to confront the state about people's sense of security, about people's fear, about people's inherent right to know how the state constructs their job in keeping them safe. There are no easy answers, and I won't even pretend I have an answer, but I find this video particularly fascinating because I think both the host and the guests speak to what I think is already there in the UK. And I think the symptoms bring up the not only homegrown far right, but the constant, what I'm calling, my opinion, far right tourist. That it's become their career to opine on the quote unquote dire state of the UK because of, the Muslims. I think that space is opened up because I do think people are angry. And I do think that the state is trying to figure out ways in which to allow all citizens, including Muslims, who are equally. There is no magic bomb that's going to go off and only kill non-Muslims. And there is no law-abiding Muslim, which the vast majority of British Muslims are, that would seek something like that. So I think that there is fear aplenty. I think there is fear aplenty, but I do agree, and I do agree with both the guest and the host, that the way in which to articulate that fear with the help of the state might not be as robust as it should be. So the state recognizing its ability to do top-down shepherding of, okay, this is how we think society should respond. Here are the spaces we're opening up as the state to facilitate the most constructive and functional response. I'm not in Britain. I think maybe from observation, after spending 25 years in Britain engaged in activism, some of it around issues, a good portion of it around issues of security, I think perhaps the anger is there. I think perhaps the far-right tourists that make their careers out of, let me tell you now what's wrong with the UK, have picked up on that anger from regular everyday people, that anger, that fear, and that the space that the state doesn't know how to provide its citizens to have a constructive conversation about what's happening, why this continues to happen, and how should we go forward, and also, why aren't you keeping me safe? I think because the state hasn't done the job that it appears the people want, I think that's open spaces for the far right, both homegrown and what I call tourist. I don't think there's an easy answer. I think British society, it appears to me, is already frayed in many ways around issues of identity, around issues of extremism, around Brexit. I think the task at hand for the state is not an easy one. I think the state continues to seek ways in which to address, first of all, to stop the extremism, okay, the attacks, and then when unfortunately they do happen, to address the societal damage that those attacks cause, and not to further exacerbate that damage. I see that that's what the state is attempting to do. Is the state successful? It appears to me that part of the reason why narratives are finding home and taking root in the UK about the Muslims might suggest that there is more work to be done by the state. It might suggest that civil society can continue to work with the state, different actors in civil society, about ways of addressing people's fears, legitimate fears, without letting that fear spill out into identity blaming narratives, which at the end of the day are equally as destructive, as violent attacks can be in some ways equally destructive, because they encourage further narratives around us and them. And once those narratives become prevalent, all manner of things, including the increase of violence, might happen. So that's counterproductive. I think it is not an easy task. I think it's not a messier task that I can imagine. How do you deal with the aftermath of extremism in a country that has, unfortunately, a history of the populace being victims of violent extremism? How does the state deal with that? What role does the state have in shepherding the people it is tasked to protect? In addition to that, I think, how does civil society, civilians, find ways of engagement with the state to let the state know the way in which you're doing this, I think can be done differently. So I don't have any answers, but when I saw this YouTube video, I had a lot of questions, and it certainly brought up the crux of the research, my research, which is focused on 3 countries: Canada, Israel, and the UK, and how private citizens, again, I'm looking at groupings of private citizens, so civil society experiences national security modeling. I think it can be a sign of respect to people who have lost their lives to extremism to ask the state, how and why has this happened again? I think it is the responsibility of the state to listen to those questions and to answer those questions. I think that can also be the responsibility of the state to not only to make sure there are open spaces, safe spaces for all its citizens to discuss what this attack has meant for me in the larger sense, and to make sure those discussions are productive and further facilitate that we are one nation and there is no other. I don't think that's easy. It's an interesting video. I think it's fascinating. I will post the link to it. And sorry this was a bit of a muddle. It's a work in progress, but it was certainly one that was intellectually very interesting for me. And it's very consuming for me. How we as civilians experience national security modeling, and how do we communicate those experiences to the state, and then how does the state receive those communications. This is Debra V. Wilson. It is Wednesday, the 23rd of May, 2018, and the time is now 300 hours and 44 minutes. That's GMT minus 6. Thank you.